Okay, so why don't we begin? Welcome everybody to our latest webinar. My name is Chris Murray. I'm the president of DC Audubon, and we have a very interesting presentation tonight on bird and wildlife friendly gardening. Just as a note before we begin, we're going to be recording the presentation tonight. So do know that when we do questions at the end, you will be recorded if you ask a question. But also we will post this on our website, dcaudubonsociety.org. So if you have to duck out early, or if you know some people who weren't able to join us tonight, who would like to watch the presentation, this will be posted for them to view at their leisure. Also, we have a chat box that has been set up. So if you have questions as we go through the presentation, you can ask your questions there. And I will ask them at the end, and then we'll also open up the discussion at the end also. So you can wait until the end to ask your question as well. But if something comes up during the presentation, you want to make sure you don't forget it, you can put it in the chat box to make sure that we do have Vincent have a chance to answer it. So to get us started, I want to turn things over to Carol Stoll from our the DC Audubon Board of Directors, who has been very instrumental in helping put tonight together. And I want to have her introduce our speaker. So Carol, please take it away.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Vincent Verweij, our speaker tonight. As Chris said, he'll be speaking about how we can attract birds to our own gardens and support birds throughout the year by choosing the right plants. Vincent's experience as a gardener began in his native Netherlands, where he gardened with his mother, growing everything from vegetables to trees. Today, Vincent is an urban forester for Arlington County, and in his own time, he loves exploring the outdoors in the region. He helps to remove invasive plants from Kingman Island, something DC Audubon Society also does with him, and the district's, which is the district's only wildlife refuge, and restoring native plant communities of the Anacostia for wildlife benefit. While always interested in all wildlife, he says that birds have come into his life through his wife, Dana McCoskey, who happens also to be a DC Audubon Society board member. He says she regularly helps him appreciate birds on their trips. His favorite bird is the hooded merganser, and like the plants he works with, he prefers birds that don't move around too much. And with that, I give you Vincent. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen on the presentation and talk a little bit about how I'm going to go through this. So like Carol said, I'm a urban forester at Arlington County, and I work a lot with wildlife and improving the wildlife habitat of the county I work in, but then also the place I live in DC. And I work a lot in my own backyard and with other people's backyards too. So a lot of people ask me questions about how can I improve my backyard to better support all kinds of wildlife benefit. I'm going to focus on birds, but I have all kinds of information on other wildlife too. Birds are part of the big food web and wildlife web of our region, and are only one part of it, but of course a very important part. So I will go through some, let me see how I advance my slides. Here we go. I will talk about what kind of wildlife you can expect and what our yards in our kind of DC region can support and what we're not likely to see here. What you need to build a great wildlife supporting yard and how to connect this with the surrounding space with parks and other neighborhoods in the wildlife network of our region. Now we're going to focus really closely on creating bird habitat because I'm sure that's some of the focus here, and how to create bird habitat in your backyard or in any yard you're working with. And then I'm going to go a little bit deeper into how to structure everything in your yard, or how you can think about different structures to maximize your benefit. Every plant person always loves lists. They're different kind of lists than bird lists usually, but they're usually species lists of things that work really well in different environments. I'm going to give some suggestions on that too, and then how you can structure and care for your garden at the end. I don't know how we typically do questions, but I think there is an option for people to raise their hand within the Zoom app. So I will try to keep an attention to that. If I miss you, just write down your question, and I can get to it at the end, or I can jump back to a slide. All right, I'm going to jump right into it. So, what wildlife is likely to appear in our backyard? So I live in DC, but even in the surrounding suburbs, what's more likely are the birds migrating through, all the hundreds of species of birds that migrate through this region, our resident birds. We have a lot of deer in our area, sometimes to the detriment of our yards, unfortunately, but they are part of our native habitat too. We have small mammals like raccoons and possums that are a big component of our urban and suburban wildlife. And then insects form some of the most important components of our food web, and are really critical to our backyard wildlife habitat. What's less likely for you to have in your backyard, though it's not impossible, are salamanders, lizards, turtles, snakes, frogs, and some of the larger mammals. But people definitely see foxes, and turtles do show up if you have a wet area nearby in your backyard. Things like salamanders don't travel very far in their lifespan, so they're less likely to show up if you don't already have them. But it's great if you do have them. Lizards do tend to travel a little bit. What's very unlikely are things like bears or aquatic animals that live in rivers, unless you happen to have a river in your backyard, in which case, good for you. And species requiring really deep interior forests are less likely to show up over here, like mountain lions. They're not likely to be in the DC region. But you don't have to go very far to see things like black bears. You go to Loudoun County or some of the more rural, mountainous and forested Maryland counties too. You start encountering some of the black bears and some of the larger mammals too. So when you plan your yard, what do you look at? The first thing you should look at is, what do you already have? Do you have a large expanse of lawn, or a lot of hardscape, or like concrete, or a deck, or anything like that that you might consider? And then what kind of plants are in those environments too? Do you have large trees that you already have that are probably hard to move, so you probably have to work with that in your environment? And it's also great to have a large tree. That's probably a great benefit to your wildlife already. What's the quality of your soil? Have you tested your soil? Is it highly compacted? Is it maybe polluted due to historic uses? For example, my backyard in DC has some legacy pollution from people parking cars in the back. So we found some lead in our soil here, so we had to deal with that. And there are ways to deal with that too, but it's good to know these things. So get a soil test. Do you have water access? Could you create water access? I'm not talking about creating a new stream, but maybe a pond or a small water feature that could really help with your wildlife. What kind of sun exposure do you have? Are you north facing, so a little bit more shaded? Or are you south facing and have a lot more sun? Or somewhere in between? And what kind of plants go with that? And then, because we're in an urban environment, we're always interacting with buildings, and then often property lines and other human-made objects like fences. So keep those in mind when you're trying to structure your yard as well. So these are the 4 key ingredients of what we're looking for to create in our wildlife garden. water, shelter, space, and food. So water is kind of an obvious, well, a lot of these are fairly obvious, but you have to think about this when you're looking at your space. Can you provide water? Is it something that you even want? You might want to be careful about creating standing water because you might create a mosquito habitat instead of a different wildlife habitat. Or could you create a situation where you can create a water feature that provides the kind of wildlife benefit that can actually control some of those negative components? Are you providing shelter? You could do that through bird boxes, but also plant material. Of course, shelter over time has been provided by shrubs and trees, and over time I meant historically before humans came around, by all the plants that we have around. So how are you building shelter into your environment? And I have a little anecdote from my one of my aunts in Holland. She has a tiny backyard, maybe something like 10 by 20 feet, but she put so many plants into it that a little hedgehog actually found a spot in her backyard and made it its home because it felt like it had enough shelter from the elements, from predators and everything else to build its home there. How much space do you have? Well, that's one thing that often people have to contend with in this area, is that we're not usually backing up to a park. And if we back up to a park, we don't have a lot of control over those parks sometimes. But what's on the property that we manage? And think about this in multiple ways too. It doesn't have to be a house that you own. It doesn't even have to be your house. You could have this influence on your church, your community center, or your even the place you work at could improve its environment. But it tends to be limited. So space is what you have to work with. Is the space that you have or have control over or have influence over is limited. So what you have to think about is where that space is and how it is related to the surrounding environment. And then finally, food, and I'm going to focus on this the most in this presentation because that's something where you can really have the greatest impact. A lot of these things like water, shelter, and space are a lot harder to create. Not impossible, but harder. But creating food and space to provide native or other foods to our birds and other wildlife is some of the greatest, where we can have some of the greatest impact. So water, one example. Here's I'm sure you're all loving this outdoor cat over here at the bottom, but it is a good example of a bird bath that maybe we should leave our outdoor cat inside, and but that can provide some benefit for birds. And you can actually see the brick that's in there. There's a reason they put a brick in there, because it allows for extra perching spots. One thing that's really cool about that too is that if you allow for a lot of perching spots, sometimes you'll even get some of our native and our non-native honeybees drinking some of this water too. So you have kind of a multiple benefit effect. If you have a little bit more space beyond just being able to provide a bird bath, you can create a little pond or even larger ponds. And you're probably gonna, if you have a little bit of connection with your surrounding natural environment, you're probably going to start seeing things like frogs and other more mobile amphibians in there too, which can be, and if you've ever seen a heron, like a great blue heron hunting, that can be a great wildlife food as well. So that's something to consider as well. But I mean, you're also providing space for those frogs. Shelter, and I thought this picture on the bottom was pretty funny. These pictures are by Alonso Abogadas, who you might know as the Capital Naturalist. He has a great blog on Facebook and on his own blogging website. But he likes to put funny pictures in his presentation. But these shelters are not always used by the things that we intended them for. But bird boxes, vegetation, and other things that we can use and add to our environment can really help with our wildlife habitat. And then how much space do you have? And I think people need to think about how creative they can get with the space that they have. So the front yard of my house is extremely limited. I have a lot of space in my backyard. But you can see my front yard in the bottom left there is about a 2 by 6 foot space over there. The picture is not with our plants in bloom, which is when it really shows its most glorious color. But I've crammed it with full of as many native plants as I can. And I could probably use a little bit of a trim, but it's the only place on my street where I've ever seen some of the native birds, like native urban birds, like grackles and things like that, hang out, because it's a little sheltered and it has maybe a little bit more to offer. But so yeah, you can do anything. You can do things with the limited space that you have available. Even if you don't annoy too many people in the public works department. On the bottom right, you can see a right-of-way that's been planted with native flowers. It look absolutely gorgeous. You can kind of see a fire hydrant hidden in there, so maybe that's helping water some of these plants. And then whether you can use your roof for space as well. That's a little bit more advanced, and you have to think about what your structural capacity of your building is. But these are some of the more atypical spaces that you can look for plant diversity as well. I'm going to talk about the obvious ones later on, like replacing your lawn and things like that. But I figured this is a good thing to talk about in DC because we often are limited in our space, and I think we can be more creative with our spaces. All right, so how are we thinking about space vertically as well, not just the green roof that I showed you? Well, how do birds look at this, for example? And this picture on the left is from the West Coast, but it really illustrates really well how the different parts of the tree and even underneath the tree are used by different species of birds. So I'm a forester, so maybe I'm a little bit partial towards trees, but they do tend to provide some of the greatest benefits to our wildlife, and particularly birds. And you can see how the larger the tree, the more likely it's going to provide greater benefit to a wide variety of birds around there. Actually, some of the species on there are actually some of the native species that we have out here, but most of those are Western species. The way birds use the trees are different too. You can see on the picture on the right, you can see some of these, the different ways that different woodpeckers and nuthatches use a tree. They approach it in different ways. So I'm going to talk about how to partition your yard both horizontally and vertically. But think about that. Think how much space you have. And if you don't have a lot of horizontal space, maybe you can create some really great vertical space. I've seen some really creative work with just a 10 by 10 plot, which had just one tree in it, some shrubs and some herbaceous plants underneath. And people saying, hey, I can't believe how many birds hang out in this tree and it only has a very limited space. So think about all dimensions on these. How are you connected with your backyard and the surrounding environment? So if you are right next to a park, like on the bottom left over here in Arlington, backing up to Glencarlin, or if you were to Glencarlin Park, if you were to back up to Rock Creek Park, for example, you're already connected to an amazing natural environment. But could you connect with your neighbors through what's known as more of a wildlife corridor, something that creates like a highway between these large natural environments to create this wildlife benefit this way? Could you work together with the backyards of your neighbors or your front yards? Don't be afraid of turning your front yard into a great place too, to really connect to rivers, to parks, to other natural areas, and really connect these spaces together. Of course, your influence on how you're connected to your region is hard to work with if you want to change that. But even your influence on the way parks are managed can really help with this kind of situation. But I'm talking about your backyard, so let's focus on that. So I actually took this from the Arbor Day Foundation, which was very timely. We got this maybe a week ago, and there are quotes from largely from Doug Tallamy, who's one of the researchers on what birds eat. So I pulled some quotes off of this thing. So these are mostly, I think these are all native birds to this region. I'm sorry if I don't know everything about birds. I know that's disgraceful. But the majority of what these birds eat is, especially now, are insects. So I can read through all of these, but you can see some of these facts. All these birds, the oriole, the wren, the flickers, the swallow, the thrasher, and the scarlet tanagers are eating hundreds and thousands of birds, sometimes in a day, to feed their young, to help them grow up, but even to just feed themselves to make sure that they stay healthy. So what does that mean? So a lot of people, when they grow plants for wildlife benefit, they think, oh, I need something with berries or seeds or nuts. And those things are very important. But it's ultimately the insects that feed on our plants that provide the food web for our bird life. So what do we need? We need plants that feed our insects. And guess what? If you have plants that are not getting eaten by insects, that means you're not providing that benefit. So I'm going to focus a lot on the different ways you can provide this vertical canopy, but also to provide the quality of plants that can provide this insect habitat to create this great food web. So here's another fact on the right. Single pair of breeding chickadees must catch 7,500 caterpillars to rear one clutch of young. That's a lot. That's a lot of caterpillars. You think about how many caterpillars you see in a day just walking around a park. I don't see that many. They must be finding them in weird places. But I know they're out there because I've seen some amazing butterflies later on that are probably the survivors of these chickadees going around. So what birds need is primarily protein, especially when they're rearing young. And that comes primarily from insects and insect larvae. And we have to think about what plants feed those insects. And then we do have to think about what other benefits we can get from our plants. So seeds and fruits and seeds and nuts are very important. And there's some things that are just not very intuitive at first. For example, poison ivy, maybe not a plant you want to have around very much, but guess what? The seeds and the fruit of poison ivy is extremely high in fatty acids and lipids and can be extremely great for a winter protein and fat source for birds. So maybe start thinking about plants in a different way. And there are also some really great ways to make your yard look fantastic while also providing these benefits. I'm going to show you that too. Now, something that is kind of unintuitive in different ways is, are you providing other prey? So aside from insects, if you want to see hawks and other predators, they might eat birds as well, but there are also ways to attract some of our native small mammals like chipmunks or small rodents like chipmunks and sometimes squirrels. It's not that hard to attract squirrels, but things that can provide a prey base for larger predators that could really help bring some of those predators in. Because if you want owls, you're going to need something like voles or mice or things like that to feed them and feed their young. So I've talked about these things, but I wanted to summarize them a little bit. So to create bird habitat, you think about all parts of the landscape. You focus on insects while also thinking about some of these other things. Provide water, provide shelter where you can, maybe through bird houses or other ways. Some birds don't even go into bird houses and they only breed on the ground, but they do need shelter. They need protection from the elements and from predators. And then just because you created the absolute perfect Blackburnian warbler habitat, that doesn't mean that bird is going to show up immediately. So be happy that you've created a beautiful place when you're creating these places, and celebrate what shows up. It might even surprise you. You might actually get things that you don't even expect. And please have patience. Plants don't grow overnight. Well, most plants don't grow overnight, and your landscape will change. Things will surprise you in positive ways and in negative ways too. You'll be disappointed at some things that you've chosen, and then you'll be really happy about some things you've chosen too. All right, so how do we build this yard? Start with the bottom and maximize what you have, starting with soil. Okay, what does that mean? So improve your soil. So a lot of the soils in our region are still very compacted from construction or just walking over it a lot. And one of the major impacts to our soil is compaction. What does that mean? It means that the space in between the soil kernels, basically, between the sand, between the clay, and between the silt, has been crushed flat. And that reduces the capacity to hold nutrients and to hold water, which allows for less plant growth. So decompacting your soil is one great way to start your yard project. If you already have great soil, good, then you can skip this step, but this is often something that people need to work with. If you buy a new house that's been built just recently, I can guarantee you that your soil is probably compacted. So this is probably something you really need to start with. And then if you are thinking about like putting an addition onto your house or putting a deck on your house, understand that that's going to probably impact your soil. There's going to be equipment that needs to come through, and you need to keep that in mind when you come through here. And just like insects are the base of the food web, the soil is the base that provides the space for plants to grow, those plants to provide food for insects, and the insects to provide food for the birds and everything else. So improving your soil doesn't have to be hard. So even if you don't have compacted soil, you can really work with this method called soil profile rebuilding, which is something I worked on with Virginia Tech, which I'm really excited about, which is a fairly easy way of just bringing in compost, tilling it in and letting it rest and spraying it down with water. You can go to this link, and I think this is being recorded. So, but if not, I'm also going to share this presentation, so you can go to this link to find out more. So one of the things that people probably think about most, I've talked a little bit about how birds use different parts of the canopy, but how do you build that? So you build your landscape from the ground up, starting with your soil, but then we go into the plants. This is a picture from the UK, but it really illustrates the different types of layers and what kind of benefits they might get from all the way from the ground, from herbaceous and vine species, all the way to the tree. And you might not want a forest in your backyard because maybe what you're trying to attract is birds that are more attracted to meadows, which are native meadows are actually one of the most endangered habitats in the region. So as much as I'm a forester, I actually encourage people to go for some of these unusual habitats too. And that's why you find so many bird species in places that are meadows, like Huntley Meadows, or in some of the meadows in Rock Creek Park too, because they're becoming so rare. These are real refuges to these birds and other species. What is this vertical canopy made of? And this is something I got from Virginia DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, but it's a good way of looking at it. Starting from the top with canopy trees that are 35 feet or taller, sub-canopy, so trees that are either about to become canopy trees or trees that are kind of right underneath that, competing with light. Understory trees, things like dogwoods and redbuds that are definitely smaller and and use the sunlight in a different way. Large shrubs that are about 10 feet of height, and smaller shrubs that kind of stay at your chest height at maximum, things like blueberries and things like that. And don't worry, I have lists later on. And then herbaceous plants is everything that's underneath, including grasses and wildflowers and meadow plants and things like that. So think about all these all these parts of the vertical canopy and see if you can achieve this kind of layering, because that's how you get that volume, that three-dimensional quality of your space really maximized. So starting with ground covers, so I'm going backwards now just to give a little bit more context to this, what this means, this layering. Ground covers having ephemerals. These are things that are, ephemerals are plants that usually only show up in the spring right before all the tree canopy leaves out, and then just disappears and lays dormant for the rest of the year. Things like spring beauty, the May apples you might still see out, some of the trilliums that you see on this picture over here. Then you have annuals, things that just live 1 year, seed back and come back in, some of the grasses, and some of the annual flowers that seed themselves into the ground. Think about vines and how they can help keep your soil alive or even work around trees. Not all vines are bad. Things like English ivy might kill a tree, but a thing like a Virginia creeper or native grapes can really add some great quality to our vertical canopy. And then starting with low shrubs and some of the ornamental grasses. Then looking a little bit higher in the understory, looking at things like blueberries. Hey, guess what? You can eat those too if the birds don't get to them first. But also just looking at what's in this mid layer, because guess what nests in this area? Well, one of the favorite birds of the DC Audubon, the wood thrush, tends to nest kind of in the like mid-story, understory, sometimes in really dumb places. Apparently, Dana McCoskey used to study the wood thrush and still looks for them, and she used to find nests that are maybe like 15 feet high on like a crooked branch that you could see really easily. So if you're looking for a place to create a place for a wood thrush, this is the right place to look for that vertical canopy. And the other day we were biking on T Street in the middle of Washington, DC, like urban Washington, DC, and there was this gigantic willow oak, but it had low limbs. And guess what we heard in there? A wood thrush in the middle of urban DC. It was just hanging out there, singing its heart out, and it had the right amount of shelter and probably just the right amount of habitat to at least hang out there for a while. I doubt it probably reproduces there, but at least it liked it enough to hang out there and sing for a bit. So that's providing a little bit of that urban connection in there. So I put safety question mark in there because it's safety for who you're looking for. This understory can provide cover for these animals to protect them from the predators and try to create some kind of like a layering effect that distracts predators from finding their prey. But it can also create, in urban areas, people don't love kind of building up their entire canopy because they like to be able to see their entire yard just for security issues. So keep that in mind, but you can still work with some of the more thinner species to work with those kind of issues. And then, of course, the canopy. Guess what? Trees. Those are some of the most important. They're the most cost effective, but they can also be the most costly. So I don't want to understate that. So plant your tree in the right place. This is going to be your most important decision, is where your trees are going to go. If you don't already have them, plant them in a safe place where they can grow well. They are not likely to cause long-term maintenance issues. Don't put them underneath power lines and things like that. And find a good place to connect to the rest of your wildlife habitat in your yard. But like I said, trees in the long term provide the greatest benefit, and I'll talk about that a little bit more too. So what plant species would you pick? So I've talked about some already, and if you know a little bit about plants, you're probably noticing that I'm mostly talking about our native plants. And well, we've got 1,700 species of native plants in the region, and they're becoming more and more available in our nurseries. So there's becoming almost no reason not to use an almost all native plant species palette, if not just an all native plant species palette. Of course, if you're growing veggies and things like that, those tend to be non-native species or very cultivated species. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what you're using for creating your wildlife habitat. Our native plants have co-evolved with our insects. So while we have some insects that are generalists and can feed on a lot of other non-native plants as well, the native plants are going to provide the greatest benefit to our wildlife that we can get. And that counts from everything from the small herbaceous and grass species all the way up to the trees. Look at how big your site is and make sure that what your site is like is appropriate for the species. So if you have a very dry backyard, maybe don't pick something that belongs in a wetland, and vice versa. If you get a lot of groundwater, maybe that is appropriate for something like a Virginia iris or something like that really works well in a wet area. One advantage of native plants is that they've also adapted to our crazy climate, and even with climate change, they're actually showing a lot of resilience to some of the climate impacts. Some species aren't showing that resilience, but we have these species have co-evolved with the DC region's wild climate that's only mildly influenced by the ocean. So after you get them established, which takes a little bit of work, you will likely have a lot less maintenance with a native plant yard than you would with a non-native plant yard. Make sure that your plants can either self-seed, or if you want them to fruit or provide the fullest benefit, that you provide pairs of a female and a male plant to make sure that they can cross-pollinate. Unless your neighbors have one, or if there's some in the park nearby, this is a good way to ensure that you get that fruit or the other benefits that you're looking for. And then look for what kind of habitat you're trying to create. Are you creating a meadow or a forest? And pick your species based on that. And like I mentioned with the poison ivy idea, which is maybe an extreme suggestion, what's attractive to humans is not always attractive to animals. So think about that when you're working with this. Katie, did you have something to say? I saw you unmute yourself. Oh, okay. I'll move along. So, like I promised, lists. Some of these some of these tree species I've been talking about, some of these provide such great benefit to our Lepidoptera, and these are some lists of how many species of Lepidoptera, and what Lepidoptera are moths and butterflies, are supported by these trees and shrubs. So on the left you have the trees, and you see some of the most high value trees are the oaks, willows, and black cherries. And these are some of the native species that are very common in this region. And oaks are very commonly planted But willows and black cherries are often seen as kind of a marginal plant, something that's tough to maintain. But if you take care of it well, it's going to be an absolutely great value to your yard. Black cherries are also kind of have a cross benefit of you being able to eat the cherries, and willows were actually, or black willows actually used to create aspirin. So these are some of the kind of cross pollinations, pun intended, with how we use these species as well as how wildlife uses these species. But yes, oaks are some of the greatest wildlife benefits in the region, because guess what eats moths and butterflies? It's our birds and our other wildlife. So the more insects they provide, the more benefit they have. And then I have a list on the right, and these are on several websites that I reference later on too, of some of the native perennials, which are some of the herbaceous species that really provide quite a bit of benefit here too. But just because some of these things are the highest benefit, that doesn't mean you shouldn't look farther down the list and see something that really works with your environment. Because if it doesn't work in your backyard or with your preferences, then it's probably not going to thrive. So pick something that works with you and works with the environment that you're working with. More lists. So I'd like to create kind of a sub-selection. I talked about the oaks. Particularly so when you're selecting trees, I particularly like the white oak, one of the highest value trees in the area, historically an amazing timber species too, maybe not what you're looking for, but hey, it's always good to know. And also provides acorns and all kinds of other insect benefits that can really build your food web. Virginia pines are some of these early succession species. So if you have a very dry site, Virginia pines can really grow up really start a good succession of species and they tend to also condition the soil well with their needles, making the soil more acidic, which is good for our native plants, because our native plants prefer our acidic soil. So that's a great way to kickstart a dry or a disturbed site. Some of the more unusual species are American plum. If you go to Huntley Meadows very often, the national champion American plum is right along the boardwalk. It's not very big. It doesn't need to be. They tend to be pretty small. And they also have our plums to eat. And then I'm showing some other species like pignut hickory, the willow I mentioned, the black willow at the bottom, and American hazelnut. So some suggestions on what you can pick from different sizes, so from large to medium to small trees and shrubs. Working with even smaller habitats, or maybe looking underneath the trees that you have, picking some shrubs like buttonbush that works really well in wet sites. Pinkster azalea is one of our deciduous azaleas that is actually a native azalea. It works well in really dry sites. Serviceberry is a very common landscape tree now, but also a native plant. And spicebush, blueberry, of course, very appealing to people who kind of want multiple benefits from their yard. And witch hazel, which is also used for some of our witch hazels, I think, in a lot of acne medicine. Not that I'm suggesting pulling off the leaves and rubbing it on your face, but hey, it's always good to know that too. So how do you combine these ideas of maybe going with wildlife food and human food? Well, I mentioned some of these already, but one really cool plant in this area is the pawpaw on the top left here. And it's the North American continent's largest fruit, largest native fruit rather. And it kind of tastes like banana custard. It keeps really poorly. That's why you don't see it in the grocery stores. But when you pick it when it's ripe, it's really delicious. And you can grow it in your backyard. And within a couple of years, if you plant a somewhat older tree, you're going to get some actual fruit growing too. American plums and service berries are easier to work with than pawpaws. Pawpaws do need multiple individuals to pollinate, but they do work out fairly well, and if you take good care of them. The black cherry I mentioned, and the blueberries, as well as the witch hazel, which you could use for all kinds of purposes. So you don't have to just go for one purpose of the wildlife benefit. You can think of this as like a food forest for all, and get creative with your species selection. So how do you structure your gardens? I talked about the connections between your plants from a vertical and a horizontal space, and I'm just summarizing this. Make sure you have connection between your plants, provide space for animals to hide, so shelter, structure those layers. You can work with a landscape architect or a landscape company that's skilled in native plant design. Make sure you find plants that work for you and for your wildlife. And then one thing that I'm going to highlight a little bit in a second is to limit your lawn too, because lawn, with some exceptions, is very limited in its wildlife benefit too. Stop mulching your yard unless you really have to. You can just replace your mulch with plants instead. And a lot of plants can work really well. Actually, one thing I showed earlier, let me go to that. This sedum on the left over here is in my front yard, and that's now taking over my entire front yard, and I've stopped having to mulch in there. And that only took a couple of years. You just have to be patient. And one really important thing is don't annoy your neighbors. Tell them what you're about to do and explain why, and work with them. And maybe there's something that they might like in there too that might make them happy, and make sure that they know what the purpose of your project is. Because guess what? There are plenty of laws out there that tell you to cut your lawn and cut everything down. And maybe sometimes even your local HOA will require you to, quote unquote, maintain your yard when you could be providing great benefit for that. Just like having chickens or bees in your backyard, talk to your neighbors and make sure they're okay with it. If they're not okay with it, at least try to make it look good, and maybe they won't mind too much. Reducing your lawn is a great way to go for it. So this is actually from the Cornell lab. Look at the area that you do want to still keep, and this is probably a generous lawn for a lot of people in DC, but the area you do want to keep, maybe a path to your vegetable garden, maybe a little play area for, this is talking about grandkids, whoever you work with, or maybe even yourself, and then everything else can be turned into a native plant garden. So think about what you want to keep as a lawn area, if anything at all, and then work with everything else. So here's some pictures of what your garden could look like. This is actually by John McGee, who runs the Native Plant podcast. I really like listening to that. And he has some great answers on, or great ideas on how to work with your garden. So it doesn't have to look wild, but it can look naturalized. It can look like something that really pops out, but also provides a lot of benefit to your wildlife. And look at this different structure. So this is the lower and kind of mid-story. Look at the higher structures of going for the full tree level of your wildlife benefit, but then also make sure you structure your lower layers. This is actually the Sunny Garden in Arlington County's Bonaire Garden, which is a great place to visit for ideas. Right now, almost everything is blooming in there. I really recommend going there. If you just have concrete in your backyard, hey, guess what? Pots with soil and a bunch of plants in it can really help liven up your yard and really still provide some benefit. This has limitations, of course, because there's no soil to dig through for a lot of these birds that like to flip leaves and things like that. But you can at least give it a shot, and this person is really taking this vertical gardening into account over here. Try to provide water on in your yard, and this doesn't look like a whole lot of space, so I think this is probably doable, but you probably have to design this just right to make sure this works with waterproofing and making sure that your pond works right. And this is kind of a joke picture on the right, but at least this picture, there's no lawn on this person's yard. Well, it's in the backyard, of course, but even this little pot has kind of maximized the amount of plants that it could get in there. Kind of unusual thing to think about is hey, do you have trees in your backyard that might be dying or dead? Guess what? Those dead trees can provide benefit for years and years and years. If you can leave the entire tree, that's great. A lot of people don't really want to take on that risk. So even leaving just a snag for 15, 20 feet tall is going to provide such benefit for woodpeckers, and all kinds of cavity nesters that live in these trees. So if you have a dead tree, don't just chop it down and cart it off to the landfill. Keep it in your yard to an extent that you can feel safe with. And if you have to cut it all down, maybe leave the wood around, because that can provide a lot of benefit as well on the ground. One thing I do want to mention is there are a lot of invasive plants in our region, and some of them are still being sold too. Some of them being sold quite a bit. Some plants are just outcompeting our native plants, and some plants are actually toxic or negative calorie benefit. One thing I take down in Kingman Island quite a bit is bush honeysuckle, Lonicera macchii. And that's a plant that has these little berries that are calorie negative. So the bird eats it, and it takes more calories to process it than they get out of it. So it's kind of pointless. And they spend energy to get to it, those berries, without any benefit. And then we have a really common landscape plant, Nandina domestica, or heavenly bamboo. And I'll show you pictures of these in a second. That's actually been shown to kill our native wildlife, specifically cedar waxwings, which are one of my favorite birds. So you can see an example of the heavenly bamboo on the left. It has these red berries, so very attractive to birds, especially in the winter when there's not that much food out, but it tends to kill our native wildlife. Then we have English ivy in the middle, which I didn't describe on the previous page, but it kills trees and it really destroys our soil. So try to avoid that as well. And then bush honeysuckle on the right, which is actually harder to get these days, but it still grows everywhere. So another thing to note before I get to the question section is, how would you care for your bird-friendly garden once you kind of start getting it established? Make sure you keep an eye on invasive plants and remove them where you can. Leave your leaves so it can provide that insect habitat. And a lot of birds also like to flip leaves to look for insects, including our state bird, the wood thrush. Brush piles, if you can leave them safely, they can create really great habitat. They can also attract snakes, so if you're not comfortable with that, keep that in mind. I personally love snakes, so I wouldn't mind having a brush pile if I had that capacity. And a common thing that people do is deadheading their plants to have them bloom more often. It tends to actually be a negative wildlife benefit, so try not to do that. The picture at the bottom right is actually a picture I just drew a big red X through, so the attribution is kind of half right. And then please avoid pesticides. There was a reason that Silent Spring was about how it killed a lot of birds through killing their eggs. DDT wasn't the only pesticide that impacts our wildlife. So it can impact the insects, which then kill the food base for the birds, or it can straight up kill your birds. And if this isn't news to you yet, leave your cat inside and encourage other people to leave their cats indoors. That can be one of the hardest arguments you can have. So talk to your natural resource manager on the best language to use with that, or even Audubon, I'm sure has just as great language to work with that too. Some great resources to use are, I work a lot with these things. One of my favorite resources is just going out to places like the Botanic Garden, looking at a lot of lists. Doug Talmy has done a lot of research on what provides a lot of benefit through native plants, and then there are so many pictures on the internet. I work a lot with Plant Nova natives in my work. They have some amazing lists with beautiful pictures online, all free that you can use for reference. And then a super nerdy project is the Flora of Virginia project, which you can find every one of those 1,700 native plants if you really wanted to. I have a bunch of links in here which will be shared too. So some of these are actually links to pictures that are on the previous slide. some locations of nurseries, how to make your yard bird friendly, a little list on that. Bringing Nature Home, which is Doug Tallamy's website with a lot of lists on great plants and trees. And then our DC's invasive plant lists as well. So you can know what to avoid. And that's it. So this is me. And I think do we have time for questions?
Definitely.
Great.
So I know we've got one question that came in the chat box from Katie, one of our board members, wondering about a water feature in your yard without the kind of mosquito infestation or overrun that can sometimes happen with that. So do you have some recommendations on incorporating water without getting overrun by mosquitoes?
So my understanding, and I'm not the expert on this, my understanding is that the mosquitoes tend to prefer still water of at least 3 to 4 inches deep. So you can limit the depth of the water. That's one way of doing it. So, or you can recirculate that water, because the mosquitoes like to breed, their larvae like to just be in still water, just water that's just laying around. And they go through their cycle in that situation. If it gets filtered or circulated, or if there is some kind of predator like a fish eating the larva, that can also help you avoid getting mosquitoes.
Excellent. So the floor is open. If anybody wants to ask a question of Vincent, just go ahead and unmute yourself and fire away. I think we have a group that's conducive to having a little bit more of a discussion. If people want to just kind of chime in and ask questions, we'd love to take them on.
I think we got another chat question.
I have one question. I know in Washington, D.C., we've got, I can't remember exactly which government, I think it's DOEE has an office that works with residential homeowners to retrofit their yard to be more efficient. Do you know, are there other kind of resources out there, maybe in the suburbs, if we've got people living out there, of kind of government agencies that can also be kind of resources, or even, I know some of them may even provide some of these services as well?
Yeah, in DC, I think there's a River Smart Homes is what they use for a lot of these conservation landscaping projects. They're usually called either conservation landscaping, usually related to stormwater. I think in Arlington, our stormwater program has a lot of grants available to re-landscape your yard. They're usually match grants, so you put in some money and they provide half of the funding for it. I know in Maryland there's a lot of projects with stormwater projects or stormwater programs that pay for people to put in rain gardens and other stormwater landscape conservation projects too. So I would usually a lot of the funding comes through stormwater programs. So if you're in one of those jurisdictions, type in stormwater landscaping. In DC, we also have an amazing nonprofit, Casey Trees, that does a lot of work with private landowners to get them to incentivize planting of trees and different things too. And they actually have a couple of grant programs there too.
Okay. So we just had a question come in the chat box. If our property has mature non-native trees or shrubs already there, is it better to leave them or to cut them down and replace them with native?
It kind of depends on what the non-native tree is. So not all trees are created equal, unfortunately. There are some trees are almost no benefit. Things like Tree of Heaven, or also known as Atlanthus, those tend to be they have almost no association with our native insects, and they might provide a little bit of shelter or some stormwater filtration. They tend to be pretty low value from a wildlife perspective. If you have things like non-native versions of our native species, so I'm talking Norway maples, or even some of the lindens, like European lindens. Norway maples has become a little bit invasive, so maybe that's a bad example, but like European species of linden or Japanese cherries, things like that, that have more of a relation to our native species, I would probably leave those and just work around with them. Then you have some things kind of in the gray area. Japanese maples are really beautiful, but they have also started invading some of our natural habitats. So I would start thinking about how you want to replace that in the long term. So there's some of these really noxious invasive species, like Atlanthus and Mimosa or Princess Tree, that I probably try to replace. And then there are some of these ones that are very related to our native species that you can probably work around. Thank you. So it's been a while since I've given this presentation. If anybody has any suggestions on improvements to my presentation, I'm also happy to take those. Either send them to me through email or send them in the chat or anything like that. I'm always open for suggestions and improvement.
Right. I have a question about, I can't do that.
I can hear you, Barbara.
Oh, okay. There's not a little yellow light under me, so I didn't think I was on. For shrubs, for things that support insects, they seem to also be the plants that the deer love to eat.
Yep.
So do you have any recommendations for perennials and small shrubs? This is in the district, small yard, that
right.
would both support the insects and the insects to get the wildlife that aren't going to be chomped instantaneously.
Yeah, this is one of the major issues we work with. I found that some of the viburnum species tend to be very deer resistant. They don't avoid them, but they tend to handle it a lot better. So those are some of the good shrubs to pick. The spice bush and witch hazel are also really good options for these. They tend to survive because their leaves and their branches tend to have more astringent flavor to them, so they don't tend to be the preferred species for deer. But on the other side of things, things that deer just absolutely love, like strawberry bush and some of the other native shrubs that we have, even the azalea that I pointed out, those are often going to be deer candy. So there are some lists online also on deer resistant plants. Often they'll have a lot of non-native species in them. But what I would do is, if you're working with a really great nursery like Earth Sangha or something like that, they can often give you suggestions on what species are great for that. I'm not really super well versed on my perennials, so that might be a better question for the nursery you're working with.
Well, how do you go to chat?
I can hear you, Carol.
Oh, what was the nursery you said? That was great.
Yeah, so there's lists of nurseries in at least the Plant Nova Natives, I know, has some really great lists of nurseries in the region. There's a nonprofit nursery that now is doing curbside delivery called Earth Sangha, Sangha. And they're a nonprofit Buddhist nursery that does a local ecotype propagation. So they get seeds from local landscapes and propagate those native plants there. And they are also so knowledgeable about plants. I really like going to them. They're a nonprofit, so I don't mind plugging them.
Good.
And most
Even-
most of the nurseries are outside of the city, especially the native plant nurseries.
Yeah. Can I ask
Even-
one more question?
Oh, sorry, Carol, go ahead.
Go for it.
So are choke cherries also, is that the same as the black cherry?
So chokecherry and black cherry are very related, but they are not the same.
Uh-huh.
The chokecherry is actually a much smaller tree and is an absolutely great wildlife benefit. So if you can find that in the nursery, go for it.
It's kind of known as a garbage tree. You know, 'cause it grows really quickly, but it is, I have one in my yard and it's like,
Maybe what you have is actually a black cherry.
uh-huh.
So the Prunus serratina is the black cherry, and that's the one. So let me see if I can pull that up. The one on the bottom left here. So
Yeah.
the chokecherry looks very similar to that too.
Uh-huh.
So it's just a lot smaller. And yeah, this is the weird thing about some of these native plants. Things like milkweed, which provides a lot of benefits to monarch butterflies and other kinds of butterflies. They're called milkweed. They were just really effective native plants. They're very aggressive usually. And it's because they probably were very good at invading agricultural fields that they got those names. Black cherry is also one of those really aggressive native species. And they can, yeah, it can be a little bit messy, but messy also means that it's providing a lot of food and a lot of habitat.
And a lot of shade.
That's right.
Yeah.
And shade
Thank
is
you.
only going to get more important with climate change
Right.
marching on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carol.
To even go back to your example of your front stoop, we have a number of our members who are apartment livers and maybe have a balcony and not much more than that. Do you have any recommendations for if you've got a really, really tiny space,
Yeah,
kind of, you know, how to even maximize that just a couple of square feet?
right. Yeah, you really have to work with things like pots or larger planters. I've seen people get pretty creative with vines overhanging their balconies. But yeah, that's probably what you have to work with, because it's not like you have a ground layer or a soil layer to work with. And I'm trying to think of, so I'm updating this big natural resources management plan in Arlington County, but half of the county lives in apartments, and I'm trying to think of ways of how to engage with those people and try to get them excited about this stuff when their own space might not be as available to create these wildlife benefits.
We have some buildings on Connecticut Avenue that have allowed the residents to garden.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, that's usually, that's why I mention things like it's not just the space that you own, but also the space you have influence over. So that includes the spaces you work at, but also maybe the apartment building. There's a person who used to work with Casey Trees down the street from me, and they got rid of all their lawn around their apartment building and replaced it all with native plants. So that was probably just one really excited person who just got it done, and nobody else seemed to be bothered too much, but they got it done. It looks great.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Feel free to send me emails if you think of something later on. I'm always happy to answer them.
Well, thank you so much, Vincent. We really appreciate this. This is one thing that I know DC Audubon has always wanted to do more of, is kind of plants and gardening. And I know Carol has been very active on our board, and I just really appreciate you spending some time sharing your expertise with us and everybody who's here tonight. I know it's a wonderful addition to what we do to try to get us thinking not just about the birds, but you know what they need to survive and thrive on. So this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
All right. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now. We're good.
All right, so we're gonna sign off. We're gonna have more webinars coming up in the near future, so please stay tuned to our newsletter and our social media accounts. We'll have announcements coming of future programming, and hopefully in the not too near future, we'll actually be able to get out and start our walks up again. But until then, please do go out, enjoy the weather, enjoy the birds, and stay tuned to future offerings from DC Audubon. Have a good night and a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Vincent.
Thank you. Take care.